I'm Mimi Jennings, and I speak from my home on land not freely ceded by its first peoples in St. Paul near the Mississippi, or Wapatonka, not far from Bedote, where the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers meet, still sacred to the Dakota people, the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, people of Manoman, the food that goes on water, and other first peoples also call Minnesota home. The three poets we celebrate tonight, Mary Moore Easter, Sean Hill, and L. Renée, are all connected in some way, as I am, to the Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference happening virtually this year, the week of June 21st. Applications just opened. Early bird discounts hold through March. More on that from Sean, if he chooses. Our fourth reader is the guy from across the street. He literally lives across the street from me. Kermit, Pattison, nonfiction writer. I am so happy to welcome you all. Housekeeping. The chat is open, and I see that many people have already found it. And writers' links can also be found there, and can also be found on the Midstream website, where you can find more about this series, and where in a couple of days you'll find a link, a YouTube link to the recording. You can also save the chat by clicking on its little file icon. After the readings, we will hold Q&A, so stick around. To honor Women's Month, I offer two of my own poems. The first portrays that same artist, our mother. The form is haibun, a paragraph of prose summarized by haiku. My mother, at 90, looks at landscape with scholar viewing a waterfall. Kai Jia, 1722. The hanging watercolor scroll catches her breath. A few strokes give false, twisted tree, visitor bent in wonder. She slides her walker aside, eases onto the Art Institute gallery bench. Convex shoulders square, incline across the parquet. Other attendees pause, go around. Fingers twitching, she studies root, gnarl. Her painting hand poises, dabs, air erases it. Squints closer, he must have strokes more slowly from a more vertical angle. Yes, half smile. Catholic, she knows little of the Taoist analogy here, water as emblem of a nobleman. Devout, she recognizes devotion. Woman, she's used to being excluded from august company. Years ago, her children mounted her only solo show in a local restaurant. Artist, she recognizes dry bristle, wash, sweep, appreciates a cataract rendered in their mutual medium 283 years earlier. Watercolorist views waterfall, visitor, ages fall away. The second is in the voice of Blessed Mother Mary. Virgin Mary's second thoughts. I'd drive a harder bargain, would trust less if I had it to do over. I'd talk back, make a stink, say, later, when I've lived more, God, get fitted with a diaphragm. I'd take up with Zeus, cloud gatherer, be handmaid to his lightning bolts, his bull. If I could heal, feed the multitude, and mind you, not just that one time. I'd commandeer the drafting board, blue penciling the plans, hold out for a better shake for girls who carry water, Tao's fountainheads, use my divining force. If I could make a church safe for children, I'd do in vitro with the sun. I would say a jillion yeses for the chance to elevate their mothers. Might have to cave to Peter, name him Pope. Eve and I would press reset, start in the beginning. A hardy garden. Befriend the snake, rename sin. Nobody would think to use a fig leaf. Heavy killing stones would lose their weight. If I could click undo, I would renounce all my titles. I who said yes too soon would take it back. I'd unsay, retype scriptures if womanhood meant shelter everywhere. That's my poetry. Now, our first invited, thank you. Our first invited reader is Mary Moore Easter. There's a reason she's first. Her newest book came out yesterday. She's a 2020 recipient of an Artist Initiative grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board, is the author of 4 poetry books, free papers, and poems inspired by the testimony of Eliza Winston, a Mississippi slave freed in Minnesota in 1860. Body of the World, Minnesota Book Award finalist in poetry in 2019. Walking from Origins and From the Flutes of Our Bones, both 2020. Originally from Petersburg, Virginia, she pursued a long dance career in Minnesota as an independent dancer, choreographer, and as founder and director of Carleton College's dance program. Mary Moore Easter.
Thank you, Mimi. This is really wonderful. I'm so happy to be here, audibly, visually, and virtually with this Midstream audience. And it takes some doing, you probably know, to make all those things happen. I've had the extraordinary good fortune this year to have 2 books come out, as Mimi said, within a short period of time, even amongst all of this grief and social upheaval. For the next 12 to 14 minutes, I'm going to introduce you to each one of them, okay? And I will repeat what Mimi said. From Finishing Line Press, free papers, poems inspired by the testimony of Eliza Winston, a Mississippi slave escaped to freedom in Minnesota in 1860. And my friends are telling me that they have the book. I am the only one that does not have a hard copy to show you. So I'm going to show you this sort of beat up copy. All right. Anyway, that's what it's going to look like when it's in my mailbox. All right. And my other book, From the Flutes of Our Bones, from Noden Press, looks like this. Okay. And has pictures of some of the generations of my family. I'm going to read the first poem in that collection, from the Flutes of Our Bones. That's the name of it. Okay, I'm excited. The poem begins. Ba-da-bop, bop, da-bop, bop, bop. That is the drum break from Mali, West Africa, that structures music, dance, and worship occasions. To the ancestor bones. Ba-da-bop, bop, da-bop, bop, bop. Black, I came to tell you, masked and beaded, scarred by clan and clan. Something came after. It was not just Black suffering to no end, a finish in death, a blank Black wall. Black, I came to tell you, something lived on and grew from every scar and song, reached out its Black arms to syncopate the globe, dug blackened fingers into the rivers of the New World, buried black flakes of skin in the jungles of the Southern Hemisphere. Fingernails tapped the rocks of coral islands. Black blood dripped down deep wells of dry places. Hair clippings blew like black seeds clicking over northern plains. Drops of black sweat fell thick in planted acres, and they sprouted. All manner of new cells grew black fruit from original seeds. Black, I am a fruited messenger, rattling with your rhythms. Ba-da-bop, bop, da-bop, bop, bop. Come to lay myself on your bones, so you may know something black did come after. The water pitcher. Great-Grandma Anna held this handle, put her palm print on its surface every time she poured water, milk, or lemonade for children who would spawn me down the line. She kept the cut glass shining, washed and polished, dried and wrapped against the harm that goes with having glass at hand in bondage times. My mother called her grandma. My grandma called her mother. Centuries spill their drops from vessels, trickle, channel, river, sea. Anna Mallory was born a slave. Where is her story? Where is her story? Eliza Winston was born a slave. She tells you something about herself in Free Papers. I call the poem character witness for herself. Every line culled from her testimony. Character witness for herself. I married a free man of color. My husband and myself worked hard. I have always been faithful, and no master that I have ever had has found fault with me. I thought I had a right to my clothes because they did not come from my master or mistress. I minded her. I told him I was not going to do wrong. I have always been faithful to him and done my best to please him and my mistress. I have been closely confined. I have never fretted or complained because I thought if I did my very best, they would perhaps give me my freedom. I would not marry anyone but a free person. I could go back to Memphis, where I could get employment as a nurse girl and could earn from $10 to $15 a month. I am sorry I must sacrifice so much. I am ready to make the sacrifice. I prefer freedom. Eliza had friends who kept the secret of her escape plans and tried to imagine the weather in Minnesota while they made her wardrobe. This poem is called "Those Who Made 2 Years' Worth of Her Clothes Tell About It." 1. He'd tell the land would be white in winter. He'd tell the white would be soft as cotton with thorns of ice, not growing from the ground, but falling from the sky. He'd tell what she gonna need for a body used to heat. I make a secret round my waist of mistress ripped pantaloons, stolen honey cover, smuggled down the slave line, ripped at will. She won't miss its rent unmended. Plenty more where that come from. 2. As long as these old fingers hold a thimble, you will not tremble in whatever cold they have for you, Eliza. You are not motherless without cover in your solitude. Take with you this vest with sleeves, stitched and doubled, cotton stuffed. These skirts and sack shirts, closed with pilfered buttons, tagged with bits of cut-off ribbon to remind your joy to rise. Inside your obedient face, your fire to blaze inside whatever cold they have for you. Take us with you in each fold and pleat, armored by the freedom that you seek. Another man done gone. Up the river, way up, from Shiloh Plantation, Mississippi, to St. Anthony Falls, Minnesota. In droves they came. They left the heat behind, the Mississippi musk and heavy air. A change of scene would do them good, the falls, and water rushing free in foam. They took their comforts with them. Cook, who kept the South inside their mouths. Slave, who'd sleep on floor outside their door, waked at any whim or need, the hand that held the sickly head and kept the children out of mind, that hefted, smooth, and scurried, dark as nighttime in the day, invisible, a nothing to imagine with a plan. Eliza came, was brought along to hold the sickly head. She left the bondage of her home behind, left friends who knew her leaving was for good, and kept her plan for freedom sealed. Left musk and heavy air, and duties owned by those whose promises betrayed her trust. She did her very best, a comfort to herself, her standard steady over churning water, her forward motion out of sight beneath the flashing surface of the paddle boat. She smoothed and scurried, closely confined by minutes, hours, days, nights, waiting to alight on land, free land. Eliza was taken to the court to adjudicate her freedom by abolitionists. This poem is called, "She Wasn't Prepared to Meet a Mob." Eliza didn't expect roses and sunshine. Where in her life had there ever been roses? Still, she wasn't prepared to meet a mob at the threshold of the courtroom, place of triumph. Free, free to walk into arms raised against her, shouts bursting above an angry murmur, malign intent simmering in the air. Her guardians grasped her arms, hustled her into a carriage. She gasped in the gallop of hooves away to a big house, away to clamor at the door, crowd gathering outside. In the simmer, she stood free, in the stairwell. When they battered the door, she stood free as the lady of the house leveled her pistol and fired a shot that backed them away. All night, the mob would not have it, this freedom that damaged their purses. Resistance lurked in the air. Protectors whisked her farther away, under a cloak, in a disguise, fear rattling her free chest, steady pulse to sustain her. How far away was freedom and rest? You have to know I am tempted to read the entire book to you, but I'm going to end with one more poem. All right. When I was told I was free, my mistress, why? I was told I was free. My master's offer of $10 to go with him. I was free. My sacrifice, free. A farming nation found me wrong, an instigation to unrest, free. A prod to catalyze a courtroom, city. I was free. Whole economy, a test of money lost, theirs. I was told I was free. And freedom won, mine. That left me fleeing still the mob outside the courtroom, their anger, when I was told I was free, as they turned their empty pockets out. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mary Moore Easter. Thanks, Mary. Fabulous. Congratulations. Where am I? Sean Hill. Sean is the author of Dangerous Goods, published by Milkweed, 2014, and Blood, Ties, and Brown Liquor, that's right over on my shelf, UGA Press, 2008. He's received numerous awards, including fellowships from Cave Canem Foundation, Stanford University, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Hill's poems and essays have appeared in Callaloo, Harvard Review, the Oxford American, Poetry, Terrain.org, Tin House, and many other journals, and in several anthologies, including Black Nature and Villanelles. He directs the Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference, normally at Bemidji State University, and lives in Montana with his family. His website, Sean Hill Poetry, is in the chat and on the Midstream site. Sean Hill.
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mimi. Thank you, Paul, and whoever else is responsible for setting this reading up. It's such a great pleasure to be reading with Mary Moore Easter and Renée. And yes, this is part of the community that I was fortunate enough to build. And I wouldn't have a community without you guys. So thank you. Thank you for doing this for us. Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference. Yes, it'll be this summer, June 21st through the 26th, online, virtual. But we're going to have 5 great workshops. I've just put this in the chat, actually. So you can see, but we have Jennifer Forrester and John Murillo are doing poetry workshops. Danielle Evans is teaching a fiction workshop. Drew Lanham, who you may have heard on Being, will be there doing creative nonfiction, and Faith Adiele, who will also be doing a creative nonfiction workshop. And we have Nikki Finney as our distinguished visiting writer. The applications are open right now. We're taking them. The early bird runs through April 1st. Check out the website. Thank you for that reading, Mary. That was awesome. You kind of got me thinking about what I wanted to read. I was like, I'll do this, I'll do that. And, so I'm trying to figure things out. I'm going to start with the poem titled Bemidji Blues. So I lived in Bemidji for a decade or so, and it is one of my homes. It's dedicated to Arnold Rampersad, who is the editor of the Collected Langston Hughes and the Langston Hughes biographer. And I met him once, and he was like, "You're from Bemidji," because that's where I was from at the time. And I was like, "Yeah, man, I'm from Bemidji." He's like, "You got to write Bemidji Blues. You got to write a poem titled Bemidji Blues." And so I was like, "All right." So the guy who's like the Langston Hughes guy is telling me to write Bemidji Blues. I got to do that. Took me some time to do it, but I did. I think it took me 3 years to get that done, but here it is. Bemidji Blues for Arnold Rampersad. Shadows bluing the snow, the pines and mine bear the cast of a kestrel's blue-gray crown. I note as I find my way about this town. Blues here, more likely the Nordic eyes kind than the blue-black of some black folk back home. Here, so many lakes reflect the sky's blue dome. Some summer days, skimmed milk blue, tints wind-blown whitecaps. Blues an adjective, verb, and noun, and the color of the world when I pine because she's gone, leaving too much wine and time. Blue shadows on the snow, mine and the pines. For the tall man, his blue ox, and now me, home is Bemidji. Though the blues here around, more the cast of a kestrel's blue-gray crown than the blue-black of my cousins back home. I think I was going to read this new poem, but I think I'm just going to put it in the chat, actually. Because you can hear me reading it at this spot. Then I'm going to go to the poem that Mary kind of put me in the mind of. Mary and the news, you know. Derek Chauvin is yeah, this trial, this thing that's happening, the things that have happened. It just reminded me of this poem from Dangerous Goods titled A Photograph Taken in Duluth. A photograph taken in Duluth. My grandmother says, beg pardon, when she hasn't heard what you've said, or is certain you can't have meant what she heard, like, I think the moon must have squinted at the dim light of that gas lamp post and the 3 men that hung from it. What I mean is 3 men, black, in town with the circus, accused of the usual lynch law crime, were chosen from 6 and dragged from jail, one by men who formed a mob, propped up by thousands of bystanders who didn't join in with the hoisting of these men up the lamp post for allegedly violating a white woman, of course, but registered approval with fists and feet while they made way for the black men, or didn't stop the hand or foot of the woman or man next to them. So 3 beaten bodies violently shook, shuddered, sputtered blood on those close by, and came to rest. My grandmother says, hush, when she's heard what you've said and doesn't want to believe it. But I have a photograph, proof of what happened in Duluth. For that, I must say, thank you kindly. That's how my grandmother always says it, to a photographer from just across the bay in Superior, Wisconsin, on hand with the thousands of other souls crowding downtown Duluth that June evening. I know he didn't take it for me. My grandmother says, have mercy, when she's heard a burdensome truth, such as the photograph was soon made into a postcard that sold quite well in local retail outlets as a memento. My grandmother didn't know these men. She wasn't born yet, but doesn't need to be shown this photograph to know the crowd of white faces staring into the searchlight. Some lean forward and stretch their necks to make certain they're in the picture. One smiles while Elias Clayton's body lies face down at his feet, hung so high they had to cut him down to be in the shot. And Isaac McGee and Elmer Jackson hang with their necks stretched, heads lolled to the side, faces turned as if they should be the ones bearing the shame or regret. This photograph isn't necessary for my grandmother to know that this happened and can still happen. And that's why my grandmother sighs and says, hush. So the resonances with what's happening, and I think about those people in that crowd, right, and what they could have done, and I think about what people are doing right now, like the protest movements that are trying to push for some social justice. So maybe the crowd will swell in the right direction. We'll see how that goes. Oh. I ended up moving farther north than Bemidji. I moved to Fairbanks, Alaska. And I met someone there. Hey, hang on a second. He's going to show up in the poem in a second, but this is Henry. All right, there we go. Dude, really? Daddy's reading. So I met someone there, and things happen as they do. Here's an Abad. It's a poem about lovers parting with the dawning of the sun, the first rays. November, Fairbanks, Alaska, and Abad. We're here. We're heading toward the end, and here now there is something missing. Morning. The dawn's not rousing till most folks in Fairbanks are at their day jobs. Morning sleeps in here this time of year, and who can blame it, as cold as it is? Is it dreaming of the warm dark of the South? And this long night that came in what should have been the early evening or late afternoon, most other places gauged by the clocks dance with the sun, 9-to-5ers driving in the night both ways on weekdays. You and I have held hands, had words and dinner, danced, tumbled and tussled before wrestling. My snoring, your nudging, the dogs budging only to snuggle closer. And now I need to get up and write this poem before I return to bed, the only warm, dark night to be known here. just before the sky lightens to that blue that precedes the peachy dawn so the streetlights can sleep. This new day's sky affords enough light to see your face and sate my need to see you again before you wake to see me, before we rise to get about our days, or hopefully stay in bed a little longer. So, this next poem is about, as I said, things happen. The first ultrasound, I got to see my son for the first time. Hello. She, being the midwife and your mother's longtime friend, said, I see a heart. Can you see it? And on the gray display of the ultrasound, there you were, as you were, our nugget, in that moment becoming a shrimp or a comma, punctuating the whole of my life, separating its parts, before and after, a shrimp in the sea of your mother. And I couldn't help but see the fast beating of your heart translated on that screen and think and say to her, to the room, to your mother, to myself, it looks like a twinkling star. I imagine I'm not the first to say that either. But unlike the first moments of my everyday, which is every moment after this one, the new of seeing you was the first, deserving of the definite article, moment I saw a star at once so small and so big, so close and getting closer every day, I pray. One more. One more in here. So this one's another poem about the boy, about the boy. One Saturday morning. It was spring in Carmel. There were birds. It always feels like spring in Carmel. It still felt like deep winter back home in Fairbanks. There were bush tits and band-tailed pigeons, acorn woodpeckers, western scrub jays, and a brown creeper, black phoebes, spotted California towhees, and the Townsend's warbler, and others. A gull floated high overhead. I stood on the patio in the least layers I'd worn in months. I held you, arms wrapped by my right arm, legs wrapped by my right arm, between my wrist and elbow, your seat. You'd only recently begun pointing out the window, trucks and cars moving along the hard-packed snow on the road back home. There were birds, a whole new community for you. And the American crow on the wire was the largest, and so I thought the easiest for your young eyes to perceive. So I pointed up at it, and you pointed with me, with what was surely my hand when I was your age. But your eyes didn't follow our fingers. They looked at me and out and inward, like when we listened to music in the kitchen back home in Fairbanks with our waving hands in the air. But on the patio, there was no music save birdsong. I pulled my hand back and jabbed it at the crow, and we were doing an old disco move. I leaned back with you in my arm and watched your eyes roll down in your head to stay level with the horizon. After a couple of tries, the crow cawed and ruffled its feathers at us, and you discovered it. Oh, your emphatic finger showing me that there was a crow on the wire, acknowledging that bird and then others. You revealed not what I knew, that there were birds one Saturday morning in Carmel, but made me feel again how the world opens before a curious body, our bodies. Thank you.
Oh, heartfelt, beautiful. Thank you, Sean. Sean Hill. Many thanks. I met Renée at that conference virtually last year. We were in the same workshop. She's a 2020 Pushcart Prize nominated poet and nonfiction writer from Columbus, Ohio, and a third-year MFA candidate at Indiana University, where she has served as nonfiction editor of the Indiana Review and associate director of the Indiana University Writers Conference. Talk to her about that one. Her poems are published or forthcoming in Tin House Online, Poet Lore, the Minnesota Review, Appalachian Review, Southern Humanities Review, the Women of Appalachia Project's anthology, Women Speak, Volume 6, and elsewhere. Her work has been supported by the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center, Kenyon Review Writers Workshop, the aforementioned Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference, and Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing. You can find her on Instagram at Renée Poems. Renée.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Thank you all. It's such a joy and a pleasure to be here on this almost spring evening with you all. I'm just so grateful for the community and hearing these beautiful poets. I'm like, oh, I gotta read after all of this nourishment? What are you talking about? Oh my goodness. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mary and Sean, for the gift and sharing your gift with us. Just so much bounty there. So thank you. And thank you, Mimi and Paul, for organizing. I'm gonna read a few poems. The first poem I'm gonna read, I actually wrote at Minnesota Northwoods, and it was actually the first poem I let go into the world that was published. I write a lot about my family's Appalachian roots from the coal mines of West Virginia and the tobacco fields of Virginia. I grapple with what of their lives I have inherited, and I look for the blank spaces, the absences in history, to write them back in those stories and those spaces. So the first poem I'll read is called Genealogical Trip to Pulaski, Virginia. The mayfly swarm undulates like the perfect hip roll, modeled bodies plow brown bodies midair. Wings fade as fine gossamer and June sun, buoyed by a buzz too quick to be caught by my eye, which doesn't want to bear the witnessing. How nature persists in getting on with it publicly, life, sex, death in the span of a day. I turn away, overcome by shame. I look through my Ford's cracked glass at white mile markers blurring a black highway. Why does our making always begin in denial? When I find my great-great-grandmother, Frances Hounshell, and census records, branded mulatto and a mother at age 9, I do not wince. I practice numbness, focus only on getting back to the alpha mama who owned her own body, her own name, somewhere off the coast of Ghana or Nigeria maybe, where her breath, not her sweat, was enough currency. In Virginia, it's common to see the dead mayflies skip across pavement like flat rocks tossed side-armed at a stream's surface, then lodged in sidewalk cracks among orphan pebbles, sticks, and sprigs of grass. I'd rather look at uncountable rows of tobacco leaves which leave me breathless, dizzy even. All those green ears flap like an elephant's hello. Hang woody scents heavy through my car vents like next of kin hugs, hugged only at family reunions. In death, female mayfly lips freeze into an O, as if reading a whistle, as if leaving evidence of no, after the males give chase, grab their tiny legs, drag them to the ground, after the mount. It happens like this. Whole lives purposed for labor and procreation. Night collects her bounty. By daybreak, bodies pile by the hundreds on window sills and porch corners in the middle of a passage pedestrian stroll between a jail and courthouse. The nice white genealogist at the local library tells me Francis's age must be wrong, an error in reporting. But I know a nymph can be snatched from her skin, molt and molt until she becomes something new, gains wings if only for a brief view of the dust she will soon call home. The next poem I want to share with you all is forthcoming in the Minnesota Review, hopefully next month. I do want to give a trigger warning for this poem. It has taken me over 15 years to write this poem, and I want to share this in honor of Women's History Month, in honor of the survivors. Sweets. The boy was my friend. We were supposed to go to the movies, but what he wanted to see started after my curfew. I had a curfew to keep me safe. I should have went home early. Instead, we went to his home. His mom would be home. We could watch a movie there. I thought I'd be safe. His TV VCR was in the basement. It wasn't finished. The boy, the basement. I could see the anatomy of drywall, not yet walls that would soon see my anatomy, the pink of it. The insulation was fluffy, like cotton candy. I loved cotton candy. I'd stuff mounds of it in my mouth, in my 11-year-old mouth, unable to stop until I puked. I loved how it melted, the alchemy, the feel of a solid thing becoming not a solid thing. At 16, I learned what it was to become not solid, how quickly pen limbs betray you, liquefy, when violence is stuffed inside the pink of you, the way it expands and melts but doesn't go away. The crystalline residue, the boy has never gone away. He was my first friend, he wasn't. Stuffed my screams with a cotton candy pink pillow. I now know nothing good comes from a thing unfinished. A movie, a boy, a basement, a hunger so sickening, you might mistake it for a sweet tooth. This next poem that I want to share has an inline taken from the beautiful poet Vivi Francis. And it's called, her poem was called "A Flight of Swiftlets Made Their Way In." And it inspired me in my research of trying to find out more about my ancestors. I always wondered why I felt like I had this insatiable appetite for knowledge. And so I wrote this poem. Some nights we have the moon. There are no swans here, just corn and potatoes pushing past small town dirt. I want to be done with want, so I tell my feet to stalk the wheat, swaying at the edge of a field, past the silos and scythes, past the scaffolding of the barn's ash skeleton, where Old Man Blue hung himself after rows of turnips refused to green. Sometimes a person can have their fill of loneliness. Desire is a tick that hides on my haunches until the bite pulses its red district light, needling my already silly goose pimpled flesh, need swelling like interminable hurricane water. When I float inside night's shade, I try not to think of the wreath of flies that lined his neck, how breath left with a tawdry grunt, but the stench of death stayed salty in my mouth, and I liked it. Can blood cover shame? The old man wouldn't want his good church friends to find him swaying like that from the rafters. So I cut the rope, watched the body land like some beached star, 5-pointed with arms and legs spread, the head bled a halo in perfect circle. I let the wolf of me spread out and howl full-throated at the pearl and ink clouds, the incessant incandescence, my back lit by air's black thicket. I shouldn't say what happened next, how 1,000 centipedes squirmed beneath my skin, how tufts of fur emerged from my pores, how I bristled like a corn husk crushed under a boot. I shouldn't say that my teeth knew exactly what to do with their new pointy tips, how top incisors tore into his flesh as any country girl would a waxy plum, careful not to open the jaw too wide and waste the tart juice jolt a tongue longs for. It is easy to suck clean the marrow. For many man's flimsy bones, gristle ultimately gives, mix his saliva into a powdery broth, some succor to sweeten sorrow's bitter crop. I can't tell you why the moon reminds me of empty seats, the rooms wiped clean of all who have left us. I can't tell you why I can't let my dead rest, why I've always savored their carcasses. I have never been whole, so there was room. This next poem is a ghazal that I wrote in honor of my uncle, who has maintained a family tradition that my grandfather started, who was a coal miner, as I said, in West Virginia. This ghazal is called Hog Killing Time. On the first day of each year, Uncle Harold must be the first to open my front door. A man passing through early brings luck, the coal miners say. It's in the blood. At 80, he visits his sister's homes before the first flake of sun, but saves mine for last, since my mama is the only one who cleans chitlins from a bucket of blood. When he gets to my house, I empty my mouth full of hungry questions about mountains, company stores, backyard strawberry patches bursting like blood. between slurps and burps, downing his intestinal soup. Boy, there's some good eating. Sure, put your foot in this. He feeds my curiosity, its persistent pumping blood. In my day, come November or December, we butchered the whole black hog, from the listeners to the trotters. Me and men round the holler, catch even the blood. Daddy stunned the pig with a 22 clean between the eyeballs. No need to squander good hide by fretting them about the end. Jitters carry spoil to the meat through the blood. I see the vat of boiling water scalding off hair, hands scraping the tufts remaining, and newly white pigskin, glistening like pearls, ready to spill guts urgent with blood. What could bring more closeness than cutting off back fat, stewing neck bones, rationing outside meat, feet, and hams for families to share like blood? We used everything except for the oink. What can I salvage from this heritage? History has wasted Black bodies, cataloged with no names, with no lines of blood. Isn't every Black living thing eventually drained? Lauren, will you ever inherit wholeness, or just stories richer than blood? My last poem I want to share with you is a celebratory one, something that my family and I have enjoyed, and I can't wait post-COVID life when we can get back to these. This poem is called Fish Fry. Everything delicious is served on Friday. Jesus should get a do-over for the Last Supper, since he missed out on the miracle that is Wonder Bread made paste by purchased cornmeal skin, sweat, and Crisco, clinging like faith to a mouth's roof, even as the tongue tries to negotiate release, swap freedom for teeth. We know what delay tastes like. We have waited for a check that affords us this feast of fish, golden crisp, and the glow of Black joy. With Luther Vandross praising us for being bad on Aunt Mary's 45 spinner, who would call this dinner? Stovetops bubble with pots of kale and collards, made sides only by smoked ham hock oozing, salty fat, their doneness determined by Mama Joyce, who dips her too blessed to be stressed mug in the pot liquor and sips slowly, purses her lush lips and declares, "It got more melting to do." Ain't that true for all of us? She snorts every time Lil Russell comes by to kiss her highest cheekbone, his jeans drifting toward hell like he forgot his real tribe. Never mind, no matter, we made it here together, the old timers will say, though they suck their teeth at the sight of his draws, at the sight of a renegger at their bidwist table, at the scent of DD's too sweet macaroni and cheese. We all fall short of perfection like memory, but Uncle Harold brings us back to where we started. Yellow perch, biting their ashen end of a line in Lake Erie's Ohio waters. The place Granddaddy, wearing his old mining boots, taught generations the patience needed to stay fed. Uncle Harold will never bring the tartar sauce Cousin Kathy out east developed a taste for. He will fling back his James Brown slick buffoned crown and howl the sound of hunting hounds choking on coal dust. Remind her she's still a West Virginia holler girl. Remind me travels ain't useful without this knowing. Thank you.
How to sum that up? I say this is a girl who lives in her body. Somebody who knows flesh and blood. Thank you, Renée. And Let's hear from Kermit Pattison, the guy who lives across the street from me. Turning away from poetry, Kermit Pattison is the author of Fossil Men, The Quest for the Oldest Skeleton and the Origins of Humankind. The New York Times called the book a riveting account and praised the author's uncanny ability to write evocatively about science. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune hailed it a brilliant book of reportage and a work of staggering depth that
word.
not death. No,
It actually
We'll
works pretty well. So yeah, I'm happy with staggering that.
we're going to get more. The search for the oldest, that brings us into the search for the oldest human. And Science News picked Fossil Men one of the best science books of 2020. Pattison has also written for the New York Times, GQ Inc. magazine, and Fast Company. He lives with his family in St. Paul and can be found online at kermitpattison.com or on Twitter, Kermit Pattison.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the three previous readers. Those are hard acts to follow. I am going to be speaking in prose here. So as Mimi mentioned, I'm not a poet. I am a nonfiction writer. And the book is about anthropology, the quest for the human past. And tonight you've heard a lot of beautiful poems about fluted bones and ancestral bones and genealogy and curiosity and bodies and carcasses. And actually this book is about all those things. By coincidence, it's about the quests for our common past, our ancestors of all of us. And it's a story about people, a group of Americans and Ethiopians who spent many years looking in part of the world in East Africa for fossil bones of the primates who gave rise to us. So I'm going to read you a little bit from the middle of the book. So the book is about, it's a science story, but it's also a story about the hardship that these scientists endured. It's a hardship both in the field, working in a very difficult part of the world, which is very rich in fossil bone, but it's also a country that was going through civil war, revolution, political purges. It's an impoverished, Ethiopia, at least back then, was an impoverished country with a lot of political turmoil. So that's one frontier of conflict. And the other, frankly, is the quest by Ethiopian scientists to assert themselves and enter a profession of human origins, which has then in particular, but and still to this day, some very colonialist roots. So I'm going to read you a portion that occurs in 1991. It involves a man named Berhane Asfaw, who is an Ethiopian man. He came to the United States to get his PhD in anthropology. He actually became the first Ethiopian ever to get a doctorate in physical anthropology. And then many people in that situation would stay in the US or in Europe because that's where the jobs are. That's where a more secure professional path is. This man chose to go back to what was then the most impoverished country in the world. And he did that because his mission was to develop science in his home country. His home country at that point was been going through decades of turmoil under a military regime called the Derg. And in fact, Berhane, was actually tortured by that regime. He was imprisoned in what they call the Ethiopian Red Terror of the 1970s. He went into prison in a chain gang with 7 men. Only 2 walked out alive, and he happened to be one of those 2. And then subsequently, he went to Berkeley and got his doctorate and then went home. He goes home and he becomes appointed the director of the National Museum in Ethiopia. And this is where the fossils go. And the famous Lucy fossil had been discovered prior to that. And so the National Museum is where this famous Lucy fossil was discovered. And subsequently, they make the discovery of a skeleton that's older than Lucy. And that's what the story is about. But I'll just read you a portion that occurs before they make their big discovery. There's a couple episodes here that just give you a couple of glimpses into the trials that went into the science of searching for our common past, the ancestry of everyone here tonight and everyone alive on Earth today. In May 1991, the rebel army massed on the outskirts of the capital. The Derg regime collapsed, and international observers feared that Ethiopia would descend into anarchy like its neighbor Somalia. President Mengistu boarded a plane and flew into exile. Generals lost control of their troops, and bands of heavily armed soldiers roamed the city. Jail doors were thrown open and prisoners streamed into the streets. In London, US diplomats brokered negotiations between the government and several ethnic-based rebel movements. Following reports of chaos in the capital, the chief American negotiator gave his blessing for one rebel army, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF, to enter the city and restore order. Western diplomats had been impressed by the discipline of the peasant force and the political sophistication of the TPLF leaders, particularly an intellectual named Meles Zenawi, a former university acquaintance of Berhane and Gede. Gede is a geologist, Ethiopian geologist who we met earlier. In Addis Ababa, 2 million inhabitants huddled in their homes and awaited the climactic battle of the Civil War. Berhane and his staff locked down the museum. In addition to fossils like Lucy, its treasures included the throne of Emperor Haile Selassie, jewels and crowns of past monarchs. A breakdown in civil order raised the specter of looters. The main building of the museum was an Italian mansion built for the viceroy during the fascist occupation of the 1930s. It stood inside a walled compound with verdant gardens and a fountain. Behind the old villa stood the little fossil lab and the fossil storeroom. As museum director, Berhane had ordered the installation of several fireproof vaults in case of artillery barrage. And throughout the city, police and soldiers abandoned their posts to avoid being shot by the advancing rebel army. Berhane went to his museum guards, a dozen men with mismatched weapons and backgrounds, including one out-of-work surgeon, and he begged them to remain on duty. At his request, they stayed. That evening, Berhane drove home through near-deserted streets. Addis Ababa was a sprawling city where corrugated metal roofs stretched for kilometers across a mountain valley dotted with tall eucalyptus trees. Tanks veered through the streets as if the drivers didn't know where to turn. Government troops wandered the capital with rocket launchers and automatic weapons. Soldiers, armed for battle, begged for food and water from unarmed civilians. An image of Ethiopian humility that remained with Berhane for the rest of his life. He arrived home to find his wife waiting anxiously with their 2 young children. The fighting began that night. Bursts of gunfire echoed over the rooftops. Berhane phoned the museum every hour, and guards reported looters pillaging the government offices next door. "Don't allow anyone to get into the compound," Berhane ordered. "You have the right to shoot, and I am responsible." But the looters never touched the museum. By morning, the rebel army had seized the capital, and state-run media instructed the populace to stay home and prohibited cars from the street. Berhane announced that he would walk the 8 kilometers to work. "What?" gasped his wife Fahiwat, fearing for his safety. "How can you go?" But he set off carrying a bag of food for his museum guards, who had remained at their posts all night and would be hungry. He made his way through checkpoints, past rebel tanks with kids clambering aboard, and found his guards waiting outside the museum gates in civilian clothes. They had stripped off their uniforms and had surrendered their weapons. And Berhane peered through the gates and saw the compound occupied by rebel fighters with big afros, shorts, and AK-47 rifles. And the TPLF guerrillas were sometimes derided by other Ethiopians as Wayanis, the term for country hicks. But the Tigrayans wore the slur with pride. They represented the peasants, not the elites who had dominated the country for the last half century. They refused to admit the director into his own museum. So the next day, Berhane and an assistant walked to the local military command post and asked to speak to the officer in charge, a wiry man who looked like he had marched across the country on meager rations. And Berhane explained the situation and asked the officer to rearm his guards. And the rebel officer looked at him quizzically and he asked, "What's a museum? What's a fossil? And if these things were so valuable, why had not the General Mengistu taken them when he fled into exile?" So Berhane led the commander back to the museum for a tour, and he explained, "These treasures belong to all humanity. We are Ethiopians, and it is our duty to curate these bones for the world. And if we destroy them, history will hold us responsible." The commander ordered his soldiers to return the weapons and donate an extra AK-47 and supplied an armful of ammunition. Ethiopia's senior scholar of human origins returned to the museum with a bundle of bullets slung in a shirt. So Lucy and the antiquities remained safe, but whether the anthropologists would remain safe was another question. And then in the following scene, we meet the American guy who was Berhane's mentor. His name is Tim White. He's a anthropologist at Berkeley, and he and Berhane are lifelong partners. But anyway, that's who you're going to meet next. He's the only American in the next scene. Everyone else whose names you might not recognize, but they're all Ethiopian from different, either from the military or from the museum that Berhane had been developing. Okay. The new government banned fieldwork again, but relented late in the year. Only those most tolerant of risk ventured into the post-war chaos, like Tim White. In December 1991, White departed with a small crew, and the highways remained unsafe due to bandits, so the fossil team joined a truck convoy escorted by military vehicles and pickups mounted with machine guns. They traveled over pockmarked roads and past burned out hulks of tanks and abandoned rocket launchers and armored personnel carriers, and finally pulled off the highway in Gawane, a small town beneath the 2-kilometer tall Ayalu volcano. It was the place of the last phone, the last pavement, the last gas, the last supplies, and the last outpost of state authority before they entered tribal territory. The expedition rendezvoused with its next escort of 5 soldiers from the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or EPRDF, the formal rebel army that had morphed into the new fledgling government. They also hired 3 Afar workers who were nervous and fearful of what waited ahead. The Middle Awash fossil fields straddled the borderlands between 2 hostile tribes. For generations, the Afar tribe and the Issa tribe had waged a blood feud whose origins no one could remember. Warriors raided back and forth and stole livestock and killed enemies. And until recently, the Derg army had enforced a tribal border along the main highway through the Afar desert. The road linked Addis Ababa to the Red Sea port of Assab and served as the country's economic lifeline for fuel, arms, food, and supplies. Soldiers had kept Issa to the east and Afars to the west. But once the Derg regime vanished, so did border control. The Issa pushed westward across the highway to the Awash River for water and grazing land, and the fossil fields had become a battleground. The caravan motored into a badlands dotted with acacias and thorn bushes, and here and there the stone crypts of Afar warriors stood atop ridges. Over time, the tombs collapsed and bones spilled down the slopes. A fossil hunter had to be careful not to mistake modern remains for ancient fossils. The cars crossed a basalt plateau and came to a place called Sibakaitu. The Afars had warned that the first Issa would appear there. Sure enough, They did, identifiable by their white skirts wrapped around legs so gaunt they looked like sticks. And the Issa men slung assault rifles over their bare shoulders. Soviet weapons had flooded the country, and the AK-47 had become as ubiquitous as the traditional daggers that the tribesmen strapped to their waist. White and the others watched as the Issa drove huge trains of cattle and goats across the river floodplain. And the fossil team and the soldiers stopped to greet some Issa elders and explain that they had come to look for bones that had turned to stone. And as a token of goodwill, an elder presented the visitors with 2 goats. Alamu Adamasu, a museum fossil casting technician, shoved the goats into the back seat and they drove on. White recorded in his field notes. Many women, children, and men were all seen waving happily. That would soon change. A young museum employee named Johannes Haley Selassie drove the lead car. 2 soldiers sat beside him in the front seat, and the Afar workers in the back grew nervous as they ventured deeper into Issa territory. The Afars wore civilian clothes because traditional attire might have gotten them shot on sight. Near the Awash, the grassy floodplain turned into a thick forest. The cars wove through the floodplain scrubland and into an ambush. Gunfire erupted and tracers whizzed through the air. A tire burst. All we could hear was flying bullets, recalled Johannes. They were shooting from both sides. We were trapped in the middle. And as the cars spun around to flee, another Issa charged directly toward them. It was the old man who had given them the goats a few minutes before. He shouted at the gunman, "Stop shooting!" And the soldiers leapt out of the cars and scrambled to defensive positions for a tense standoff. Soon, about 20 Issa gathered in a noisy bunch, and the shooters seemed totally unfazed by the presence of the soldiers and utterly unapologetic about nearly killing the fossil team. The Issa elder explained that some kids had gotten spooked by the unfamiliar sight of vehicles. They thought it was some kind of an Afar army coming to get rid of them, recalled Johannes. Bullets had hit White's trailer and narrowly missed its cargo of fuel tanks. Miraculously, no one had been hurt. The old Issa tried to smooth things over. Could the visitors just please take their goats, drive ahead, and forget about this little misunderstanding? We were terrified, very, very terrified, recalled Zalila Masifa, an antiquities officer. He looked nervously at White and feared that the hard-charging American would insist on pressing ahead. But even White was spooked. Too fucking dangerous. Around the next bend might be another band just as trigger-happy as this one, and perhaps they would be better shots. The team dared advance no further. And as they drove away, more gunfire echoed from behind. Whatever fossils lay ahead would remain hidden yet another year. So, stop there. And it goes on like that for 400 pages. So.
Wow. It is an interesting, I read what Mary put in the chat. It is an interesting contrast. We've been reading all of this up close, careful parsing of human history as it comes through individual, through our bones. And then to hear the search for bones back into deep history. Thank you. So thank you, Kermit, Pattison, Jay Roosh, Mary Moore Easter, Sean Hill, Renée, and Kermit Pattison. We are so grateful for your creative work and your sharing. Paul Mattis, Zoom host, many thanks. I'm Mimi Jennings. I'm one of 4 poets who organize these readings. The David Shove Memorial Midstream Reading Series happens monthly. On April 8th, Richard Terrell will welcome poets Steve Healy, Yana Knittel, Richard Robbins, and Katrina Vandenberg. Lovely lineup. Thank you, dear audience, for your attention. Please unmute. You can add comments as you will. So, but if you want to talk, just raise your hand.